To prepare and comply with GHG reporting, it's important to know what's required. First, determine which climate-related regulations apply to your company by using this easy-to-navigate flowchart. You can refer to video number 2 for more detailed information. Next, it's important to identify which stakeholders, such as customers and investors, are requesting GHG emissions data. Understanding their needs will help shape your reporting strategy. Now it's time to develop your roadmap. To help with that, we sat down with Brian Burns and Lisa Becker.
Hi, Lisa. So would you say it's important to have a team involved in this?
Absolutely. I would say not only having a dedicated team, but making sure that that group is consistently involved in the process, from collecting data to reporting the data, and really a group that can have the insights into what systems are currently being leveraged for reporting that could also be leveraged for reporting this new climate-related or greenhouse gas information. Thinking about technology that exists and what technology might be needed to streamline this process, and really taking ownership over the reporting requirements start to finish within the organization. It's critical too that this dedicated group can consider the needs not only of the company, but also of its stakeholders. So anticipating what customers might need related to this and teeing up systems that can be leveraged to support that internal reporting effort, as well as the reporting requirements that other related organizations may have.
So obviously a lot of legislative requirements. After we have the team in place, let's talk about what data is actually needed to be reported under each bill, and we'll start with SB 253.
For SB 253, that regulation requires reporting of your Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So at a high level, Scope 1 emissions are your emissions that are directly produced by your organization. Typically, that's going to be fuel use like gas, diesel, propane, natural gas. In the meat processing sector, we also have to include on-site wastewater treatment as well as one of those Scope 1 sources. For Scope 2, that's any purchased electricity, heat, steam, cooling. So you can think of that as emissions that are produced off-site in that energy generation, but the energy itself is used on-site. But the biggest piece of that is really that electricity use for most companies. And then Scope 3 is all of our value chain emissions. So for that, we would think about all emissions that are occurring upstream and downstream of your organization.
We've heard from our members that Scope 3 has some unique challenges. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So with Scope 3, it can be really challenging to quantify that information, mainly because that information isn't housed within your organization. And due to the types of emissions within your value chain, the actual science behind the quantification of emissions is also challenging. With the requirements under this regulation, it's following global protocols for quantifying this information. And there's a lot of estimation that is allowed to capture these types of emissions. So even though it can be challenging to, say, quantify the emissions associated with ag production, so whether that's manure management or enteric emissions, feed production, there's a lot of strategy that can be done to figure out what level of estimation is appropriate given the amount of information your organization currently has. And then over time, work on getting that information to be more and more accurate as more data is obtained.
And can you give a little more detail about what would be required under SB 261?
Under SB 261, that one is related more so to climate-related financial risks as opposed to providing that greenhouse gas inventory information. So under 261, that would require you to report these risks under the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And this is a globally accepted disclosure framework specifically for these climate-related risks. And within it, there's 4 key elements that would be required, focusing on governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So for companies required to report under this regulation, there is really key guidance to follow and a structured way to go about capturing these risks. Typically, that climate-related risk is broken up into physical and transition risks, and so this TCFD framework will help your company assess those.
So I'm sure our members are wondering, when's my deadline for this? When does the reporting need to be provided?
So the deadlines for reporting under both of these climate-related bills are all contained within the regulation. And it's important for members to know exactly when they're required to report, that they're referencing the most recent version of the regulation. So in there, it'll explain not only when the disclosures are required, but also what time frame that data that you're reporting needs to be reported under. So typically we're dealing with data being reported in the subsequent period for that prior period information.
There's a verification component as well. With regard to GHG inventory development, how can you develop that documentation to be audit ready in the future?
So it is really crucial to be thinking about that audit readiness at the initial start of reporting. And part of that is because there's varying levels of assurance that are required under these bills. So audit ready, when we think about how to make emissions disclosures audit ready, typically that's providing and documenting information about how you're quantifying your emissions, what standards you're using, what methodology you're using, if there's any data omitted, what data and why, and having all of that captured when you're initially developing your inventory so that when it comes time to report and when it comes time for that independent verification, your company already has the documentation ready to go for those types of inquiries.
Transitioning to climate-related risk assessment, is it possible to leverage existing broader strategic planning for business risks and opportunities, and how would you go about that?
What we sometimes see when companies are looking to meet these types of regulations is creating a separate team for climate reporting or greenhouse gas inventory development. And really, we find that the most successful strategies integrate risk assessments and all of this greenhouse gas planning into broader strategic initiatives. So really focusing on how that risk assessment can leverage and incorporate other processes that your organization has around risk is likely going to be the most successful way of meeting these regulations.
So Lisa, that's a lot of data and obviously a lot of new requirements for companies to navigate. Are there resources available, or can you give some guidance to companies that might be confused by this?
It's a lot of new information, absolutely. And so for companies to be successful in reporting, it's important to know how much estimation you can or should use as part of this process. Thankfully, under the requirements of SB 253, estimation is allowed and really should be leveraged to make sure that your company is reporting information to the extent that data is available. It's also important to know that there's a lot of resources to support companies in doing these types of disclosures. So within the global guidance under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as well as some industry-specific guidance that's been put out by the MEAT Institute, there's a lot of information to support your company in gathering this information and figuring out the best way to meet these disclosure requirements that isn't going to require too much of a lift for your organization.
Stay informed, stay prepared, and embrace the future of transparent and responsible business practices. For more information, review Pinion's resource guide or contact a Pinion advisor today.